My name is Iris Ashford, and I'm 39 years old. For 14 years, my family believed I filed paperwork in the basement of a courthouse somewhere. Then, on a Saturday morning in October, my mom grabbed my shoulders in her kitchen and told me to confess to a felony my sister had committed. A man was lying in the ICU with a shattered hip. My sister had been driving my car. My dad did the math out loud, the way he does everything. She has a campaign. He said, "You have nothing to lose." My sister didn't even look up from her phone. She simply smiled and asked, "Who would believe me anyway?" They had a lawyer sitting at the kitchen island before anyone asked me a single question. And they were so certain of the answer that they had already typed my confession. What none of them knew about my job, what my car had been recording, and the woman who was awake and waiting when my sister came home that night took this family apart piece by piece over the next 7 weeks. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally tell the stories their families spent years making sure nobody heard. If you've ever been the one your family underestimated, stay with me, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. I drove 6 hours to county because a 13-year-old asked me to. My niece Emma texted me in September. She said her grandpa was turning 68 and asked me to please come. She put a heart at the end of it, and that was enough. I hadn't been back in almost 3 years. The house looked the same, which was its own kind of insult. White columns my father couldn't afford and never stopped paying for, with a banner over the porch that said Ashford for State Senate in the same blue as my sister's eyes. Inside the front hall, there was a wooden bowl on the side table, and every set of car keys in the family went into it the second you walked through the door. My mother started that when I was 7. She called it hospitality. It was really inventory. I put my keys in the bowl like everyone else. In the living room, there was a wall of framed photographs, and I'm in 9 of them. The newest one was from a graduation that happened 14 years ago. After that, the wall simply went on without me. Nobody planned that. That's the part people don't understand. Nobody sat down and voted me off the wall. My father found me by the punch bowl and introduced me to a county commissioner and a man who owned 4 car washes. This is our oldest. He said she does something with filing at a courthouse. The commissioner nodded politely. I shook his hand and said it was nice to meet him. And I let it stand because I always let it stand. I'd been letting it stand for so long. It had stopped feeling like a decision. Being invisible was the one thing this family ever let me be good at, and I'd become very, very good at it. By 11, the party had thinned down to the people who didn't leave. My sister Colleen was still going, still on the path she's been on since she was 16. She has a face that knows where the camera is, even when there isn't one. She'd had wine, not much by her standards, which is its own sentence. Someone remembered the yard signs were still in the storage barn, out past the tree line. And my mother said it could wait until morning. And Colleen said it absolutely could not, because a volunteer was coming at 7, and it would look disorganized. That's the word she used. Disorganized. I said goodnight and went upstairs to the guest room, which is the second door on the left at the top of the stairs. The one with my old twin bed and a closet full of my mother's winter coats. I could hear the front hall from up there. You always can. I heard the keys shift in the bowl, that flat wooden rattle, and I heard the storm door. And I thought about nothing at all. I read for a while. At about 5 to midnight, I heard the garage door come up and go back down. Then 2 voices in the kitchen. Low, the way people talk when they're trying not to wake somebody. It didn't sound like an argument. It sounded like arranging. I fell asleep. When I came down for water, sometime after 1, the bowl in the front hall was empty. Not one set of keys in it. In a house with 4 cars in the driveway. I noticed it the way you notice a picture, hanging crooked. Then I went back upstairs and didn't think about it again for 2 more days. I should have. The local news at 7 came on while I was making coffee. A man had been struck on Route 9 near the co-op just before midnight and left there. He was 61. He was in critical condition at Mercy Regional. Witnesses had seen a dark SUV heading east and part of a plate. The anchor moved on to a high school football score. I stood there with the coffee pot in my hand and felt the house change temperature around me. My father had been in his study with the door shut since 6, which never happens on a Saturday, and I could hear him on the phone using the voice he saves for people who owe him something. Colleen didn't come down. My mother said she had a migraine. Then I went out to the driveway for my bag and found my mother already out there in a cardigan over her nightgown, wiping the inside edge of the garage door frame with a dish towel. At 7:15 in the morning, she smiled at me and said, "The pollen this year was unbelievable. My SUV was parked at the end of the row, and it wasn't where I'd left it. I'd backed in the way I always do. It was nose-in." I walked around to the front of it. The right headlight housing had a crack running through it like a dropped windshield, and there was a scrape of something pale along the bumper, while the whole panel was clean. Not clean like a car, clean like somebody had gone at it with a rag. I stood there with my hand on the hood, and my mother came up the driveway behind me and didn't ask what I was looking at. She simply said, "Come inside, Iris. Family meeting." Dale Whitfield was already at the kitchen island. He's been my father's lawyer since before I could drive. And he taught me to cast a line off the dock at Kettle Lake when I was 9. He had a legal pad in front of him and a cup of my mother's coffee, and he'd been there long enough to finish it. That was the first thing that told me what kind of morning this was. They didn't call a lawyer after they talked to me. They called a lawyer instead of talking to me. My father came in and sat down and did not say good morning. They started talking. And I want you to understand how they talked, because it's the whole thing. Nobody said, "Is he going to live?" Nobody said his name. They said exposure. They said the next 72 hours. They said, "If this gets a narrative before we give it one." Dale said the phrase manageable outcome twice. My mother poured more coffee, and beneath all of it, in pieces, the actual facts assembled themselves in front of me like furniture coming out of a box. Colleen had taken keys out of the bowl at 11:30. Colleen had taken my SUV because it was the last one in, and nothing was blocking it. Colleen had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon. Colleen had come back at 5 to midnight with a cracked headlight and hadn't called anyone, and my mother had made her a cup of tea. Nobody had called 911. Nobody had driven back out to Route 9. A man had lain in a ditch beside his bicycle for 19 minutes before a truck driver found him. Then Dale slid a sheet of paper across the granite, turned so it faced me, already typed, already dated. It was a confession. Mine. I read it twice. It said I had borrowed the vehicle, that I had been unfamiliar with the road, and that I had panicked. Someone had put the word panicked in my mouth at 6 in the morning. My mother came around the island and took hold of both my shoulders, and she looked at me with more warmth than she'd shown me in 3 years. And she said it plainly, like she was helping. "Just say you were driving." I asked her if she understood what she was asking. She said she understood exactly, and that's why it had to be me. No husband, no children, no campaign, a job nobody could name. My father didn't get up. He looked at me across the counter with his reading glasses pushed up and laid it out the way he'd lay out a budget line. "She has a campaign," he said. "You have nothing to lose." And there it was, the whole family ledger in one sentence, spoken out loud in front of a lawyer. And not one person at that island flinched. Colleen came in then in a sweatshirt, hair up, no makeup, and poured herself orange juice while I told them no. I said it once evenly, and then I said it again because the first one didn't seem to register. Dale said we should all take a breath. My father said we didn't have time to take a breath. And my sister leaned back against the counter with the glass in her hand and looked at me the way you look at a dog doing a trick badly. And she wasn't even angry, which was worse. She said, "Who'd believe you anyway?" I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. I got as far as the doorway. And then my father said one more thing, and it stopped me with my hand on the frame. Colleen already gave her statement. He said, "This morning at 7, your name is in it." I turned around. Dale wouldn't look at me, which was how I knew it was true, and how I knew he'd helped write it. She told an investigator that her sister was visiting from out of state, that her sister had asked about the highway on-ramp, that her sister had gone out around 11:30. Not an accusation. Better than an accusation. A helpful detail from a cooperative family. I stood in that doorway and did the arithmetic they were certain I couldn't do. The vehicle was registered to me. The witnesses saw a dark SUV and half a plate. I was asleep alone in a guest room with no one to say otherwise. And the first person to hand police a story owns the shape of the story. Everyone who comes after is simply disagreeing with it. My father was watching me work it out, and he thought what he saw on my face was fear. It wasn't. It was recognition. I had spent 8 years as a public defender, standing beside people who got convicted of things they didn't do, and almost none of them lost because of evidence. They lost because someone got there first. I put my coat back on the chair, not because they had won, but because leaving county that morning would have been the most useful thing I could have done for them. The out-of-state sister who came for one night and left. They knew a version of me that was 14 years old, and they'd never bothered to check whether it had changed. That was their first mistake. It would not be the most costly one. I should explain what happened when I was 25 because it's the foundation of everything. I failed the bar exam the first time I took it. 40% of my class failed that year. It's a footnote in most lives. It happened in July, and my father was 6 weeks away from a re-election, and a man running for county commissioner needs a story that makes him seem human. So at a fundraiser at the Elks Lodge, in front of 200 people who bought gravel and sold insurance, he told them his oldest had gone off to law school and washed out. He shrugged and said, "You can't win them all." The room laughed, and he got the warmth he needed. My mother was standing beside him. Later, in the parking lot, I asked her how she could let him say that. She adjusted my collar. She was gentle about it, which is what I remember most. She said, "We don't have truths in this family, sweetheart. We have versions." I passed the bar in February. I never told them. I left county and took a public defender position 400 miles away. And I learned something during my first year that I mistook for wisdom for the next 14. If you don't tell people anything, they can't take anything. So I stopped telling them things. I stopped correcting the filing clerk joke. I stopped sending news. When I was sworn in years later, I stood in a robbing room and buttoned the collar myself, alone, because I hadn't invited a single person who shared my last name. I told myself the silence was dignity. It took a man bleeding in a ditch on Route 9 to show me what it really was. By Sunday afternoon, the state police had taken over the case from the county because Walter Boone had gone from critical to still critical, and the charge was going to be a felony either way. A detective? Dana called the house and said she would be scheduling interviews with everyone who had been at the residence Friday night. My father took the call in the hallway with his hand over the receiver. Then Dale came back at 4 with a cleaner draft of my statement. The word panicked was gone, replaced with became disoriented, and he placed it on the coffee table and said there was no rush. Then he said the county attorney's office would want something by a week from Thursday, which is a rush. That's how it works. Someone tells you there is no pressure and then gives you a deadline in the same breath, and you're expected to hear the first part. I went onto the porch and called a woman named Renee Okafor, who I'd sat across from in a courtroom 9 years earlier and had never forgotten, and I told her everything in about 4 minutes. She asked 2 questions. She asked whether I'd said anything to an investigator. I hadn't. She asked whether I'd touched my vehicle. I said, only the hood. She said, good. Then she said, don't touch it again. And don't be alone with any of them. I'll be there Tuesday. I sat on that porch after we hung up and looked at my SUV at the end of the driveway with the cracked headlight. There was one thing inside that car none of them knew existed. It had been recording from the moment someone turned the key. And the problem, the entire problem for the next 5 weeks, was that I couldn't simply go and take it. People think a modern car is just a car. It isn't. It's a witness that never blinks and doesn't care who paid for it. Mine is a 2023 model, and it does 3 things nobody thinks about when they purchase one. It connects the driver profile to the key fob, so the seat and mirrors adjust to whoever is holding it. It automatically pairs with a phone and records that information. And it has an event data recorder that activates when the airbag sensors detect a hard enough impact and saves the 5 seconds on either side of it. speed, brake, throttle, steering angle. I sat in the passenger seat Monday morning with the door open and one foot on the driveway. I turned the screen on and did not touch anything else. The driver profile was set to guest. The seat was 4 inches forward from where I normally keep it. And under the phone menu, in the list of paired devices, there was one that hadn't been there Friday morning. Colleen's iPhone connected at 11:31 at night and disconnected at 11:57. I stared at that for a long moment. Then I turned the screen off, got out, closed the door, and did not remove a single thing from that vehicle. And I want to be clear about why, because it was the most important decision in this entire story. I'm a federal judge. I have excluded evidence for less. If I personally pulled that data from my own car as the person they were about to accuse, every hour of it would become a question about me. At breakfast, Dale mentioned that the family would take care of getting the headlight repaired. There was a body shop in that could take it Wednesday. I said that was thoughtful of him. Then I went upstairs and called my insurance company. I explained in the flattest customer service voice I could manage that my vehicle might have been involved in an incident while it was in another driver's possession, that liability was unclear, and that I wanted a claim opened and the vehicle preserved in its current condition while the investigation was pending. It took 11 minutes. The adjuster placed a hold on the vehicle before lunch. No shop in 3 counties would touch a car with an open claim and a preservation hold because they wouldn't get paid and could get sued. Nobody had to tell them no. From Monday afternoon onward, there was simply no way to repair that headlight, no way to vacuum the interior, and no way to move that seat back 4 inches. It was the most ordinary thing I did all month. My father found out Tuesday because the body shop called Dale to cancel. He didn't mention it at dinner. He passed me the green beans, asked about the drive up, and looked at me for about a second and a half longer than a person normally looks at their daughter. I'd spent my entire career watching people recalculate at counsel tables. You can see it happen. Something they'd filed under settled quietly moves into the open column. He was beginning to wonder whether the daughter he'd written off in a parking lot 14 years earlier was actually the person standing in his kitchen. He didn't ask. Asking would have required believing there was something worth knowing. My mother refilled his water and said the beans were from the farmer's market, and everyone agreed they were good. On Wednesday, I drove to Mercy Regional and sat in the surgical ICU waiting room for 2 hours in the corner. I did not tell anyone who I was because I wasn't anyone there and had no reason to be anything else. Walter Boone's wife was in the chairs by the window. Her name was Sharon. She had a canvas bag with a crossword book inside that she never opened. A nurse came to update her, and Sharon did what everyone does when speaking with medical staff. She tried to make him a person instead of a hip. She said he'd worked the line at the Blue Star Diner for 30 years and could plate 40 covers an hour without ever getting an order wrong. She said the truck needed a transmission, $1,800. And Walter had decided in August that he'd ride the bike until Christmas and put the difference away because that's what he did. He made decisions and then followed through. She said he had a helmet. He wore the helmet. She said that twice to the nurse, like the helmet was an argument she needed to keep making. And on the corkboard beside the coffee machine, between a flu clinic notice and a church bulletin, someone had pinned one of my sister's campaign cards. Her face, that smile, the blue, and beneath it in white capital letters, the slogan her consultant had focus grouped in June. Accountability for county. I looked at it for a while. Then I got up, put $4 into the vending machine, bought Sharon Boone a coffee she hadn't asked for, set it down beside her, and left before she could ask me my name. Thursday morning, I went to see Dale Whitfield alone at his office above the pharmacy on Main, because there was still a version of the world in my head where a decent man had been pulled into something and needed one honest conversation to find his footing. He had a photograph on his wall of himself and my father and 2 other men holding up a stringer of walleye at Kettle Lake in 1998. I was in the corner of that photograph, 11 years old, holding the net. He poured me coffee into a mug that said World's Golfer. I told him everything, not as a suspect and not as a lawyer. I told him about the bowl, the keys, the seat position, and the timeline. He listened the way he used to when I was a kid, explaining a knot, nodding along, and letting me finish. When I reached the end, he set his coffee down, and he said, "Sign the statement, kiddo." He said it kindly. He said the county attorney was prepared to be reasonable, that with no prior record, it would be a deferred sentence, and that in 18 months it would be nothing more than paperwork. He said, "It's the version that saves everybody." The man who taught me to cast off a dock was quietly explaining why I should accept a felony for my sister, and he believed he was being generous. And on the desk between us was a yellow legal pad. Clipped to the top was a memo slip with a letterhead I recognized because it had appeared on 100 filings I'd read during my first year of practice. The office of the county attorney, Rex Calder, my father's first campaign volunteer, class of 1994, Renee Okafor, had come up that Tuesday and taken a room at the inn near the highway. And that afternoon, after I returned from Dale's office, she made me say all of it aloud again, while she took notes in handwriting I couldn't read upside down, which I suspect was intentional. Then she told me where I actually stood, and it was worse than I'd allowed myself to put into words. 1. The moment I pulled anything from that vehicle myself, I became the accused person handling my own evidence, and any competent attorney could turn the rest of the hearing into a discussion about my hands. 2. The ordinary channel for all of this, the county attorney's office, was run by a man who had been at my father's side since before I could vote, and a file could sit in an office like that for a very long time without anyone technically doing anything wrong. 3. And she was careful with this one. I held a federal judicial commission, which meant I didn't get to be clever. Not one phone call to anyone I knew. Nothing said to any reporter, ever. Nothing that could ever be described as a judge using influence over a case. Every ordinary advantage a person in trouble might have, I had to give back at the door. I said, "So I have the truth and no way to move it." She kept her pen in her hand. She said, "Data gets challenged all day long. Chain of custody, tampering, spoliation. I've done it myself and won." Then she said something I've thought about every week since. "A witness under oath is a different animal, Iris. Sooner or later, this case is going to need your face." My face. The one thing I'd spent 14 years keeping out of every frame in that house. We did it on a Friday afternoon in the parking lot of a strip mall in Hugh. Because Renee wanted concrete, cameras, and a business address in the record, she hired a forensic technician named Priya from the Capitol, and Priya brought her own equipment, paperwork, and a phone on a tripod that recorded the entire process. Renee narrated it for the recording like a woman reading a grocery list. Date, time, location, participants, vehicle identification number, odometer. Priya photographed the headlight, bumper, seat rails, odometer, paired device list, all of it before she touched anything. Then she removed the module and the storage card. And when she finished, she held them out to me on her open palm, and I stood in that parking lot holding the entire night of October 11th in my hand for about 10 seconds. It's smaller than a key. It weighs almost nothing. Priya asked if I wanted to review the contents before she sealed it, and I said no. Renee's eyebrows went up a quarter inch, which for her is a shout. I said, "If I watch it first, then every answer I give from this point forward is an answer I've had time to shape, and one day somebody is going to ask me under oath whether I saw it before telling my story, and I will want to say no." So Priya placed it in a paper evidence bag, sealed the flap with red tape, and signed across the seal and dated it. Renee signed underneath her, and it went into a locked case in the trunk of a rental car. I didn't know what was on it. I only knew what my car had been awake for. And Route 9 wasn't the only thing it remembered that night. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't really about a car. It's about who your family has decided you are and what happens the first time you refuse to agree with them. If you've ever been written off by the people who were supposed to know you best, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. Now, let me tell you what my mother did next, because she waited for exactly the right moment. And she is very, very good at this. Sunday, there was a dinner, not a family meeting, a dinner with the good plates and pot roast with the little onions, which I had loved since I was 6 and had not been served in this house in more than a decade. My mother had taken out the album, the thick green one, and it sat at the end of the table like a third course. Emma was there and was allowed to stay up. My father asked me about the district where I lived and listened to the entire answer. Colleen passed me the rolls and said she liked my haircut. It was the warmest room I'd been in with these people since I was in my 20s, and every bit of that warmth was on purpose, and knowing that did almost nothing to protect me. After Emma went upstairs, my mother placed her hand flat on the table and made the offer. Dale had spoken to Rex, a plea to a reduced count, no jail, community service, a deferred judgment that would seal in 18 months. Then she said the part she'd been saving, softly, looking directly at me. And you'd be part of this family again, Iris. Really part of it. Sunday dinners, Emma's birthdays, all of it. For 14 years, I'd been standing outside that window, and my mother finally opened the door, and the price on that door was a felony and a man in a wheelchair. The frightening part wasn't the offer. I'd been offered things by better manipulators in worse rooms. The frightening part was sitting at that table with the pot roast and onions, feeling how much of me still wanted it, and understanding for the first time that they had always known exactly how much. Walter Boone woke up on the 18th. I heard it from a nurse's aide who recognized me from the waiting room and assumed I was a cousin. He'd come out of the second surgery. They'd put the rod into the tibia, and on the 22nd, they got him upright for the first time. I was down the hall when they did it. 2 physical therapists, a walker, and a 61-year-old man with a hip full of hardware trying to move 8 feet across a room. It took him 4 minutes. When he reached the chair, he made a joke I couldn't hear, and both therapists laughed, and Sharon stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth. My father had told me I had nothing to lose. I sat in that hallway and counted what Walter Boone had already lost. 30 years of standing on a line for 8 hours was gone. The doctors were saying he'd walk with a cane and he'd never work a full shift again. $1,800 for a transmission he had been saving toward while riding a bicycle at night in October. 19 minutes in a ditch. And in the waiting room on my way out, the television mounted in the corner was showing my sister at a podium in front of the county building in the navy blazer, saying that her family was cooperating fully with the investigation and that her heart was with the Boone family during this difficult time. She'd found exactly the right catch in her voice. I'd watched a lot of people testify. I could not have told you it was fake. The press conference wasn't a defense. It was a frame. 2 days later, the Register published a piece about the investigation, and buried in the 11th paragraph was a sentence attributed to a source close to the family. The source said the vehicle belonged to a sister who was estranged from the family, who lived out of state, and who had been having a hard time. That's all. 3 facts, all technically true, arranged into a person. Estranged, out of state, having a hard time. I read it in a motel parking lot and felt something I hadn't felt since I was 25, which was the particular vertigo of watching a version of yourself being created by people who shared your last name and knowing that the version would always travel faster than you could. That evening, Emma texted me for the first time in a month. She's 13. She wrote, "Aunt Iris, did you really do it? Nobody will tell me anything." I sat on the edge of a motel bed and typed and deleted about 6 answers. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her that her mother had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon, had left a man in a ditch, and had allowed her aunt's name to go into a police statement, and every word of that would have been true. And I would have been doing to her exactly what her grandfather had done to me at a fundraiser in 1998. So I wrote, "I did not. I promise you I'll tell you the whole thing when it's over." And I put the phone face down, because when I told that kid the truth, I wanted it to be provable. And those were 2 different things. I drove the 6 hours home on a Wednesday for one day, and it was the loneliest 24 hours of the whole thing. I went to see the circuit's ethics council, a small, precise man named Howard Lynn, who had an office with no windows, and I self-reported before anyone could discover anything, which was the only move that had ever worked in the history of this kind of trouble. I told him a member of my immediate family had implicated me in a state criminal matter, that I was likely to be a witness, and that I intended to cooperate fully. He wrote it all down. Then he gave me the rules, and they were the rules I already knew and had hoped he might soften. I do not identify myself by office in connection with any of it. I do not contact anyone at the county attorney's office, the state police, or any court in any capacity other than as a private citizen represented by counsel. I make no public statement of any kind. If a reporter calls, I say nothing. He said, "You understand that in practice this means you will have fewer options than an ordinary person, not more." I said I did. Before I left the courthouse, I stopped in my chambers, which were dark, and stood there for a minute. The robe was on the back of the door, where it always was. I had worn it for 2 years, and it had never once made me feel like the person my family thought I was. It had only ever felt like something I borrowed from a serious institution and had better take care of. I locked the door and drove back to county with one suitcase and no title at all. Whatever came next, I'd face it as nobody in particular, which fortunately for me was the role this family had been training me for my entire life. Thursday came, and I didn't sign. There was no scene. I sat in my mother's living room and said I would not be signing anything. My father folded the newspaper and said, "All right," and that was the entire conversation. Then the house began to close one room at a time in the polite way. Friday, my mother mentioned that her sister was coming through and would need the guest room, so I moved to the inn out by the highway, which had 40 rooms, a waffle machine, and a view of a grain elevator. Monday, a letter arrived from Dale Whitfield's office on his letterhead addressed to Renee. It said his firm represented the Ashford family. It said that any suggestion Colleen Ashford had operated the vehicle was contradicted by the family's recollection. And it said in a sentence that took me 3 readings to fully understand that the family would, if necessary, describe how the vehicle had been made available to another driver that evening by its owner with knowledge of the circumstances. There it was. If I wouldn't be the driver, they'd make me the person who handed the keys to a drunk. Same felony neighborhood, softer paperwork, my name in it either way. And that afternoon, Detective called my cell and asked whether I could come in Wednesday morning to the state police post in Tuts. Then she said, in the flat way that people say things, they've decided to say it a certain way, and please bring your counsel. I hung up and sat on the edge of that motel bed and understood that I had been formally moved into a category. The state police post-in was a brick building with a flag and a vending machine that only took exact change. Renee met me in the lot. Dana was about 45, and she had the specific patience of someone who had been lied to professionally for 20 years and had stopped taking it personally around year 6. She began by telling us 2 things that I didn't expect, and that changed the shape of the month. The first was that 11 days earlier, the state police had gone directly to the manufacturer with a warrant for the telematics on my vehicle, its own copy of the paired device log, and the crash record from the company's servers. Nothing to do with me, my hands, or my sealed bag. The world had a second door, and it had been opening the whole time without asking my permission. The second was that Colleen's statement had a hole in it. She'd told them the household was quiet after 11:15, but a neighbor's doorbell camera across the county road had recorded headlights coming down the Ashford driveway at 11:29 and returning at 11:56. And my sister had placed herself upstairs for all 27 of those minutes. Then asked me to walk through my night. I did. The bowl, the stairs, the book, the garage door at 5 to midnight, the voices, the water, the empty bowl. No adjectives, no conclusions. When you've listened to 10,000 witnesses, you learn that the honest ones are boring and the liars are vivid. At the end, she turned back a page, stopped, and read something twice. Then she looked up at me. "One more question," she said. "Occupation." I hadn't planned it. There was no moment when I decided the day. She asked a routine question from an intake sheet, and I answered, because you either respond to investigators' questions truthfully or you don't answer them at all. and there is nothing in between that ends well. I said United States District Judge. The room became silent. Renee looked at the table, said nothing for about 4 seconds, which feels like a long time in a small room. Then she wrote it down. She asked which district, and I told her, and she wrote that down too. She had one follow-up, and it was a fair one. She asked why it wasn't in the file. I said, because nobody had asked. She closed the folder, stood up, and walked us out through the front. At the door, she extended her hand and said, "Thank you for coming in, Your Honor." My mother was in the lobby. She had driven over by herself without telling anyone, sitting in a plastic chair beside the vending machine to be useful and available and learn what was being said about her family. She was 6 feet away. She heard everything. I watched my mother's face change in a way I had seen 1,000 times from the bench, but never once from her. It wasn't pride. Pride looks different. It was calculation, the exact expression of someone moving an item out of the liabilities column and quickly trying to determine what it might be worth. She said my name once. I kept walking. In the parking lot, Renee asked whether I was all right, and I stood there holding my keys and said, "Who would believe you anyway?" "Well, we're about to find out." The news reached the house within an hour. My father called that evening and asked me to come over. I said we could talk on the porch, and we did, with the door closed behind us and the yard light on. During the drive, I had prepared myself for the wrong reaction. I thought he'd be angry about the concealment or embarrassed, or that somewhere in the conversation would be one sentence about wishing he'd known. My father was pleased. He sat down in the wicker chair and called it remarkable. He said it twice, then immediately started planning. Did I understand what this changed? A federal judge. His hands were moving now. A federal judge who takes responsibility for a tragic accident, who steps forward and doesn't hide behind her position. He said it could be reframed within a week. He said Rex could be brought along. He said the story would stop being a family protecting a candidate and become a family of public servants. And Colleen's numbers would rise, not fall, because voters forgive a family that accepts its mistakes. He had found a way to spend my confession. 14 years of not knowing what I had done. And within an hour, he had calculated the value. The answer was that I was worth more as a confession with a title attached than I had ever been worth as a daughter. I sat on the porch rail and let him finish. That was when I stopped hoping. Not the kitchen, not the letter, not the leak. It turns out hope is the last thing they take. And they don't even take it deliberately. They simply say what they really think out loud, and then it's gone. 2 things happened that week. On Tuesday, Rex Calder gave a statement to the Register saying his office had reviewed the matter, that the evidence so far did not establish who had been operating the vehicle, and that he would not charge anyone at that time. He used the word tragedy and the phrase grieving community, and Walter Boone was not dead, and nobody at that paper questioned him about it. On Thursday, Dale filed his supplemental letter. 4 members of the Ashford family were ready to state that I had made my vehicle available to my sister that evening, knowing that she had been drinking. 4, my father, my mother, my sister, and because they needed a 4th, and she was there, my Aunt Charlene, who had gone to bed at 9. Renee explained everything to me at a booth in the diner by the inn. The state police had a strong file, but a state case is prosecuted by the county attorney, and the county attorney had just publicly announced that he wasn't prosecuting. The only thing that overrides a man like Rex Calder is a record so clean and so public that refusing to charge becomes more costly than charging. Sworn testimony on the record from the one person in that house whose account contradicted the other 4 and who had nothing to gain by giving it. She said, "It has to be you, and it has to be in the open, or it doesn't happen at all." That was when I finally understood the shape of the last 5 weeks. There was one door remaining in this entire situation, and it could only be opened from the inside. Let me stop here for a moment because I want you to consider the question I had to face that night. If telling the truth cost you your entire family, not an argument, not a bad Christmas, but all of it permanently, would you still tell it? Don't answer too quickly. Put your answer in the comments. I'll tell you shortly what I chose and what it cost me. And if you're new here, subscribe because you're going to want to see how this ends. She came to the inn alone on a Sunday night, wearing an old sweatshirt with the hood down. She drove her own car and parked it around the side near the ice machine with no phone in her hand. I had never, in my adult life, seen my sister with nothing in her hands. I let her inside and she sat on the edge of the desk chair. For about 10 minutes, she was someone I had never known. She talked about being 16, about the summer. Her friends went to a lake house, while she attended media training at the Capitol because Dad had arranged a slot through a friend. She talked about learning to hold a smile for a photographer's third attempt. She said that when she was in 9th grade, she received a C in chemistry, and our father didn't speak to her for 4 days. She said it as casually as someone discussing the weather. Then she looked at me and said, "Do you know what it's like to be this family's only investment?" And I did know it actually from the other side. She didn't apologize. That's the part I need you to understand. During that entire conversation, she never once mentioned Walter Boone's name. She never asked how he was. She never said she was sorry for anything except her own position. What she had come to do was make a trade. "Take the plea," she said. "You're strong enough to survive being the failure. You've been doing it for years. I'm not." For about a minute, I could see the sister I might have had if this family had been involved in any other business. Then she stood to leave. As she passed the window, she checked her reflection and touched her hair, and the campaign returned to her face like a light coming back on. They scheduled the meeting for Wednesday at 11 in the conference room above the pharmacy, and everyone came. My father was wearing a jacket. My mother had her handbag in her lap. Colleen wore the navy blazer. She had come straight from a radio interview. Aunt Charlene and Dale sat at the head of the table with a folder. Inside the folder was the third version of my confession. Beside it, placed squarely on the wood, was a black fountain pen with the cap already removed. I have thought a great deal about that pen. He had uncapped it before I entered. That's a man who has never once been told no in that room. Renee sat down and opened her briefcase. I picked up the pen. I did. I want to be honest about that. I held it, and then I put it back on the table, pushed it a few inches away, and said no in a voice I didn't need to raise. Then Renee began reading. At 8:40 that morning, we had filed with the Office of the Attorney General a sworn affidavit from me describing everything I had told you: the bowl, the keys, the seat, the paired device, the garage door at 5 to midnight, the meeting at the kitchen island, and the typed statement. Attached was a formal request for the appointment of a special prosecutor on the grounds that the county attorney had a documented 32-year political relationship with a person of interest. Also attached was a chain of custody affidavit from Priya and a transfer receipt for one sealed evidence bag delivered that morning to the state police post at Brangan. My father said my name. My mother said it 3 times in 3 different tones as she followed me to the door. The sharp one, then the soft one, then the one from when I was small. I didn't turn around. For 14 years, I had been the quiet daughter of the Ashford family, and she died in that doorway on a Wednesday morning. I left her sitting at the table with the pen. That night, something slid under the door of room 14. It was an envelope, with no stamp, written in my mother's handwriting. There was no letter inside. There was a photograph of me at 7 years old on the front steps wearing a red coat and holding a cat we had for 2 years. On the back, written in ballpoint, it said, "Kitchen tomorrow 9, come alone please." She had underlined please. So I sat at that kitchen island for the second time, in the same seat, with the same coffee. And my mother told me what she had never told anyone. On the night of October 11th, she did not go to bed. She stayed awake because there were still 4 people in her yard and a caterer's van in the driveway. She was in the front room at 5 to midnight when the garage door went up. She met Colleen in the kitchen. My sister's hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't get the tea out of the box. And my mother went through the mudroom, stood in the garage, and looked at the right front of my vehicle at the crack and pale scrape. Then she came back inside and took every set of keys from the wooden bowl in the front hall and put them in her cardigan pocket. Not so nobody could drive, but so that at 7 the next morning, when the news came on, nobody could say what had been where. She had known since 11:58 that night. She knew when she wiped the door frame. She knew when she poured Dale his coffee. She knew when she came around that island, placed both hands on my shoulders, looked into my face, and told me to say I was driving. I asked her why she was telling me now. She reached across, took my hand, and cried while remaining completely composed. I realized she hadn't come to confess. Confession requires regret. She had come to negotiate. The hearing was the next morning at 9:30. She had 18 hours, and she used every one of them carefully because my mother is the best strategist in that family and always has been. The proof is that nobody outside the family has ever heard her name. She didn't threaten me. She didn't mention the 4 affidavits, the letter, or the register. She held my hand on the granite and made me an offer. It was the only offer in 14 years that ever had a chance of working. "Come home," she said. "Not for a dinner. Come home. Be our daughter again. Christmases, Emma's graduation, your father will put your picture back up. I'll do it myself. Everything you've wanted since you were 25, and you know it, and I know it." Then softly, almost tenderly, she added, "All you have to do is not remember her quite so clearly tomorrow." She wasn't asking me to lie. She was too intelligent for that. Lying under oath is something you can be prosecuted for. She was asking me to be uncertain, to say I couldn't be sure about the time, that I'd been asleep, that it had been a long day. Nobody would ever be able to touch me for it. Walter Boone would go home with a cane and an insurance settlement. My sister would be in the state senate by spring, and I would get my family back. She finished it the way she finishes everything, with the sentence she taught me in a parking lot when I was 25, only turned into a gift. "Pick the version where you still have a family, sweetheart." I looked at the wall beyond her shoulder at the photographs that stopped in the year I turned 25. I gave her my answer in one sentence, then drove back to the inn and slept for 6 hours, which surprised me. What I said to my mother in that kitchen was this: "Mom, I've spent 14 years being the version that was convenient. Tomorrow, I'm going to be accurate." Then I said I loved her because it was true, and because I wanted it on the record between us. Then I left. The county courthouse is a limestone building from 1911 with 9 steps and a bad handrail. At 29, the next morning, there were 2 television cameras from the Capitol and 3 reporters at the bottom of them. They knew by then. Someone at the register had reported the appointment. The headline that morning had the word judge in capital letters next to my last name: forever. A woman put a microphone near my face and asked whether I had any comment on my sister. I said no comment. She asked if I was there in my official capacity. I said I was there as a witness. She asked one more question about the family, and I said no comment. Then I went up the 9 steps and through the doors. I did not stop, and there is no clip of me anywhere saying anything about any of it. That was the entire strategy, and it cost me more than anything else in this story. My father had told me I had nothing to lose. He was right in a way he had never bothered to examine closely. I had nothing they had ever counted: my name, my oath, and my spine, and I was about to spend all 3 of them in one morning. Inside, the courtroom smelled like old radiators. In the first row on the aisle, in a wheelchair with a cane across his lap and his wife beside him, was Walter Boone. The special prosecutor was a man named Grant Ellery, appointed 8 days earlier from the Attorney General's office, and he had a talent for asking short questions. I was sworn in at 10:15. I sat in a wooden chair in a room with a ceiling fan that clicked once with every rotation, and I told it in order. The bowl in the front hall and what my mother started at 4, the keys going in at 4 in the afternoon, the wine at the party, the yard signs and the storage barn, the stairs, the second door on the left, the rattle of the bowl, the storm door, the garage at 11:56, the voices, the empty bowl at 1 a.m., the news at 7, the dish towel, the crack in the headlight housing, and the seat 4 inches forward and the paired device that said 11:31 that night, the lawyer already sitting at the island, the typed statement with my name on it and the word panicked in it, which someone later changed to became disoriented. I did not editorialize once. Priya had testified before me and placed the sealed bag into the record, red tape and signature and date opened in front of the clerk, matched line for line against the manufacturer's own telematics that the state police had obtained independently weeks before I ever handed anything to anyone. Then Colleen's attorney stood for cross-examination, and he was good. He went exactly where I would have gone. He asked how a family could possibly fail to know that their own daughter sat on a federal bench. He said it twice, with the right amount of disbelief, and turned toward the gallery when he said it, because he wanted the room to hear how absurd it was, and he was right that it was absurd. I let the fan click twice. Then I said, because I helped them not know for 14 years. I made it easy. That's my share of this, counselor, and I finished paying it. He asked me to clarify, and behind him at the defense table, my sister began speaking quietly to her lawyers. Here is something I have learned from 11 years around criminal courtrooms. People who are coached for cameras are the worst witnesses alive because a camera never interrupts you, while a courtroom does little else. Her attorney told her to sit down. She didn't. She stood at the defense table in the navy blazer with her hands out, palms up, the gesture she uses at the end of a stump speech, and she began to reframe. She said, this had been turned into something it wasn't. She said her sister had been away from the family for years, and there was context the court wasn't hearing. She said the word narrative aloud in a courtroom, which is something you can only do if you have never in your life been in one. The judge told her twice that she would have her opportunity, and on the third attempt, she reached the end of the sentence she'd been circling for 7 weeks, and it came out of her at full volume in a room with a court reporter. It was one mistake. One people like her get to make their entire lives, and it costs them nothing. I don't get even one. Nobody moved. Walter Boone looked at the floor. In the third row, my mother put her hand over her mouth. And I don't know to this day whether it was for her daughter at the table or her daughter in the chair. Then the judge gave the ruling, and it was over in the flat administrative way these things actually end. Probable cause found. Bound over for trial. Conditions of release modified. Surrender of passport. A subpoena was issued that afternoon to Ashford regarding the location and handling of a set of vehicle keys on the night of October 11th. And I sat in that wooden chair while the room emptied and thought about my sister asking me who would believe me anyway under oath with the truth and a technician's signature across a seal. Everyone, Colleen. That's the entire point of the building. She took a plea in February to felony, leaving the scene of an accident involving serious injury, 60 days in the county jail, 3 years of probation, restitution, and a license suspended for a year. She withdrew from the race in a statement that ran 90 seconds and thanked her supporters. Dale Whitfield is under investigation by the state bar for his conduct in preparing a statement for an unrepresented party, and he has not written to me, and I don't expect him to. Rex Calder announced in April that he would not seek another term and joined a firm in the Capitol that handles municipal bond work. My parents were not charged. Ellery examined it carefully and told Renee the truth. Proving what my mother did with a set of keys in her own house past a jury was not a case he could win. I want to be honest about how that felt. It felt bad for about a month. Then it stopped. A courtroom is a narrow instrument, and it was never going to give me what I actually needed. And by spring, I understood that what I actually needed had already happened in a doorway above a pharmacy. The party organization placed a county supervisor into my sister's spot by March, and he is doing fine. My father still has his table at the Legion breakfast. Nothing was cleansed. That's not what happens. Walter Boone went back to the Blue Star in December, 4 hours a day, 3 days a week, on a stool they bolted down for him next to the flat top. The civil side settled with the insurer in the spring. It isn't enough, and it's more than he would have gotten. He bought the transmission and then bought Sharon a greenhouse. I stop in whenever I'm in the county on paperwork, which I still am. He lets me buy a coffee and then charges me for the pie. Howard Lynn closed my ethics file in March with a 2-line memo. Judge was a fact witness in a family matter. No use, no violation. And on the shelf in my chambers, behind the desk where most judges put a photograph of their family, there is now a picture of an old man in an apron standing outside a diner with one hand on a cane and the other on my shoulder. In May, Emma texted me. She wrote, "Mom says I'm not supposed to text you, but nobody will tell me what actually happened." I typed for a long time. Then I told her the truth, all of it, in the plainest language a 13-year-old could understand. And I did not make either of her parents a monster, and I did not make them innocent. She wrote back, "Thank you for saying it straight. Nobody ever says it straight." There's one more thing, and it's small, and it's the reason I'm telling you any of this. In June, a new clerk started in my chambers, 24 years old, nervous, very serious about the coffee. During her second week, in the middle of nothing, she asked me whether I had family nearby. A year ago, I would have said no and let it pass the way I let everything pass for 14 years, and she would have written me down as private and been right. Instead, I heard myself say it aloud, the entire true sentence. "No, my family's 6 hours away and we're not in contact, and it's because my sister injured a man with my car and my parents asked me to take the charge, and I testified." She didn't know where to put her face. I told her it was all right, that people mostly don't know what to say, and they don't have to. Then we went back to the motion calendar. My mother was right about one thing, and I've decided to let her keep it. Families do run on stories. That part is true. But I'm done telling versions. If your family only loves the version of you that remains convenient, that was never love. And the day you stop auditioning for it is the day the rest of your life is finally allowed to begin. That's my story. One empty key bowl, one sealed evidence bag, and one signature I never gave. If there's someone in your life who has you filed away as the family failure, hear me. You do not owe anybody a smaller version of yourself. Not at Thanksgiving, not ever. If this stayed with you, send it to someone who needs it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next.